Well, it's so good to see you guys. And I do teach at a seminary. So when I came to the seminary, they said, well, Dr. Branch, you're at a seminary now. And at a seminary, we like classical music. Do you like classical music? I said, man, I love classical music. They said, who do you mean, like Vivaldi or Beethoven or Brahms or Bach? I said, no, I love the classics. Waylon, Willie, Merle, George Jones, Johnny Cash, the classics. And so what I'm about to show you is not classic music. It is Lady Gaga. I don't listen to a lot of Lady Gaga. However, Kevin Smith has volunteered to come and sing this song for you. He's a deeply devoted Lady Gaga fan. He's waiting over here in the wings. He's ready to burst in. No? Okay, well, I thought. Tammy, help me out on that. So, but here's the song. It was a huge hit. It's infinitely popular in our culture. I work out at lunch at the Gladstone Community Center there just north of the seminary. I like working out at lunch because it's not crowded and the only people there are senior adults, right? But one day I'm in there working out, and Lady Gaga's in the background, and I'm watching senior adults around the room. I'm born on the right track. I'm born this way. So here's her song, Born This Way. The verse says this: no matter gay, straight, or bi, lesbian, transgendered life, I'm on the right track, baby. I was born to survive. No matter black, white, or beige, chola, or orient maid. Stop right there. I've learned from some other folks the term chola is usually a put down, and apparently she misuses it in the song, but she's basically referring to folks of Mexican heritage. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born to be brave. So notice what she does right there. She joins two different things: someone's sexual lifestyle with their ethnic heritage. Do you see how she does that? The first set of lines, she's talking sexual lifestyles, and then the second set, she's talking ethnic heritage. And she says it's all the same thing. And this has been extremely, extremely compelling to young people. So the kids in your high school, I guarantee, here in Lebanon, well, you're the Yellow Jackets, right? I'm a Georgia Bulldog fan. I have a hard time just getting souped up over somebody called the Yellow Jackets because that's Georgia Tech where I come from. I'm a Georgia Bulldog fan. Lost to Vandy today. Georgia lost to Vandy today. I mean, you better look for the trumpet and the second coming. We lost to Vandy. Man, they're awful. This is Lebanon, not Lebanon. Well, I'm from Georgia. Everything gets dragged out in Georgia. I mean, you ought to hear me speak German. Boy, it gets to hear German with a southern accent. Absolutely fascinating. But y'all are so nice to me. I'll be honest with my accent. Most places where I speak, as soon as I open my mouth, my IQ drops about 30 points in the minds of most people. And y'all haven't treated me that way at all. Like somebody started playing deliverance tunes around me, but that's okay. So she joins these two things, and this is compelling. In Lebanon, I guarantee you that the kids in the high school, if you ask them what they think about homosexuality, it's this right here. Well, it's just like being black or white or some other ethnic heritage. It's all the same thing. You're born that way. And here's what the chorus says: I'm beautiful in my own way because who? God makes no mistakes. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way. So, in fact, this is all part of God's plan. So how do we respond to this? This is the driving narrative in our culture about homosexuality, that people are born innately homosexual, and it cannot be changed. It's not their fault, and we shouldn't hold them morally accountable. So that's the driving narrative in our culture. Now let me begin by saying, here's the thing. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not a physician, and I'm not a scientist. I'm a guy that teaches ethics to Baptist preachers. I have studied one area very deeply, so I know a lot about the talking points and the arguments being used in favor of the Born This Way arguments. As I said at lunch, I want to repeat again, because I know this to be true. For some of you, this is not just an exercise in an academic discipline about what the evidence shows and doesn't show. When you hear this subject, what you think of is a grandson or a granddaughter that came home and told you, Grandma, Mama, Papa, I'm homosexual. For some of you, your parents, and it's a son or a daughter. For some of you, it's been a best friend, a sister, a brother. You had a brother that had a gay marriage or a sister that had a gay marriage and invited you to come to their same-sex wedding, and you had a real moral dilemma about what to do. So I understand, and my goal is not to load guilt and unneedless grief on top of you. My goal is to try to help us walk through, over about 30 or 40 minutes, some of the main arguments about this Born This Way argument. And I, of course, as you might imagine, I don't have time to cover everything. The research is immense. There is tons of stuff out there. I mean, new stuff every year. And so I don't believe that I've created a straw man argument here. I believe that what I'm about to walk you through, 5 central areas, I'm giving you the most commonly cited studies. Of course, there are others, and if you're have a web browser, you'll find others. But the ones that I'm going to go through tonight are the most common and the most prevailing, and I do not pretend that this is an exhaustive discussion of the subject, but I am trying to be accurate and address the most common ones. And I'm very sensitive beyond a family member. For some of you, you've experienced same-sex attraction. Some of you that you've had this temptation or participated in the behavior. And so the whole issue is, what does it mean to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ? And my goal is not hatred or homophobia or any of those things. My goal is just to try, as a Christian, take a hard look at the evidence. So that's what we're going to do and walk through some things. Let me give you some talking points. First of all, what we're going to see is that homosexuality is not a trait like skin color. The second point is correlation doesn't equal causation. I'll explain that more as we go through, but that's a way of talking about statistics. Did any of you have statistics in high school or college? Did any of you have a statistics class? I had statistics in 1987. Oh, my word, it was miserable at Kennesaw State. But what I do know is that correlation does not equal causation. No trait has been discovered, and I'm using language from argumentation here. If you ever had a class on arguments in high school or you're on a debating team in high school, you should know this. But no trait, I thought about saying variable, has been discovered which is both necessary and sufficient for homosexuality. And finally, predisposition doesn't equal predetermination. So that's what we're talking about. So I'm going to walk you through several of the theories. I'm going to start with the first one that you may be surprised. It's actually it's gaining more traction. So this is one that I hear more frequently. It is in fact about prenatal hormones. And so to try to orient you into what I mean by the prenatal hormone argument, you are aware that little babies, as they're growing in the womb, you may not know this, but boys and girls have the same primitive genital structures when they're born. And in girls, the DNA in girls makes those genital structures turn into ovaries, and they begin to release female hormones. And then in boys, those primitive genital structures in the first few weeks of development turn into testes, and they begin to secrete male hormones, and then that drives the development of their little genitals either in the direction of a boy or a girl. And that's why between weeks 18 and 20, your physician gets an ultrasound and they take a picture and they say, we think you're going to have a boy, or we think you're going to have a girl. So just to give you some of the idea of the confusion about prenatal experiences, I have a quote on the next slide from a guy named Troy Perry, who's the founder of this large homosexual denomination called the Metropolitan Community Church. And this is a quote from his book called The Lord is My Shepherd, and He Knows I'm Gay. And it is odd, and it is peculiar, but I'm not taking him out of context. I'm not just quote mining. He means this quite seriously. He says, one thing is certain about me. I feel I have a total sense memory that predates my birth by a good long time. It's like being a seedling soul in two parts, your mother's and your father's genes. I have an awareness of having been a seedling, a physical presence in my father's sperm and in my mother's ovum before they were united. Someone says, Dr. Branch, what does that mean? I'm not trying to be funny and I'm not trying to make a joke. This means this is a man who's very confused. That's what this means. And if you get what he's driving at there, what he's actually saying is, well, I have a female part and a male part, and that's what drives my homosexual orientation. But this idea of having an awareness of being back in his father's sperm or in his mother's egg, it's just bizarre. So this helps you understand kind of what we're dealing with. So here's the prenatal hormone theory. Here's what they're going to say. That during the development in the womb, when their genitals are being formed, that the boys and the girls got the right hormones and their genitals formed correctly as a boy or a girl. But during brain development, they got the wrong hormones or not enough of the right hormones. Therefore, even though they have the genitals of a male or a female, their brain got the wrong hormones, and so they are therefore attracted to males even though they have male genitals, or they're attracted to females even though they have female genitals. And this is basically the substance of the prenatal hormone theory. Now, the next slide I want to tell you, it's based on animal research. A lot of it is. We should stop right now and have a moment of silence for the things that the poor rats, mice, and other rodents have gone through in the name of science. And they have done bizarre things. And so what they've done is they've taken little rats and rodents in utero. Sometimes they've castrated male rodents in utero to see what would happen to them when they grew up. As you might imagine, they turned up being odd. Sometimes they would pump large amounts of the wrong hormone into the uterus of the little rat as she's carrying babies to see what these babies would act like. As you might imagine, they get flooded with the wrong hormones. Some of these rats and some of these mice would try to mount other mice of the same sex, or they would present themselves to other mice of the same sex to be mounted. Now, let me tell you why this argument sounds compelling. And I think people in Lebanon, I'm not teasing, but I really think Lebanon, Missouri is going to understand what I'm about to say. Part of the reason this argument is compelling, oh, well, you have these mice. Look, they're homosexual mice. Oh, my goodness, what are we going to do? They got the wrong hormones. They're homosexual. That must mean that the prenatal hormone theory is true. Well, actually, what that shows is confusion in our culture about how animals are raised. Because I want to tell you, in Lebanon, I know you know different. I live in Kansas City. I can hit my neighbor's house with my Red Ryder BB gun, right? And so everybody's crammed on top of one another. What most of the children in Kansas City know about animals, they learn from Disney films, right? And so the animals sing to each other and they talk to each other and they're going, you know, oh, Simba, Simba, and all these sort of things. And that's what the animals do. But as I was riding down here on Highway 65, yesterday I had the window down. I had a smell that I had growing up. It was a smell of cattle and cattle manure. By the way, I had the shortest 4-H project in the entire 4th grade at Hiram Elementary School in Paulding County, Georgia. My calf got struck by lightning and died. That was my report. It's an act of God. I didn't have anything to show at the fair or anything, just dead. That was my 4-H report. But if you've been around a farm, some of you men know what I'm about, some of you ladies and gentlemen know what I'm about to tell you, and I'm not trying to be crude, but it's a fact. If you've been around a farm, you've seen some old stallion try to mount another stallion or mount a gelding. You've seen some old bull trying to mount another steer or mount another bull at some time. In thousands of years of human history, nobody's ever said, well, you know, I guess they do it. It must be all right. No one said that until the last 50 years. Some of that directly related to the fact people are a step removed from being around animals, and so they just don't know how animals act. Listen carefully. Animal behavior is not volitional. They just act instinctually. They don't have a will like you and I do, especially cats. Cats have no will. In fact, our dog died last summer. Dr. Pepper, the dog, died. He was a mutt. I loved that dog. Man, he was the best. I'm not kidding. He was the best dog. And I asked Pastor Kevin for an answer. He didn't give me one. I asked him for a theological answer. I had a serious question. I said, Pastor Kevin, I asked him at dinner last night, didn't I, Ben? I asked him, I said, Pastor Kevin, why did God let my dog die and the cat live? That's what I want to know. Talk about the problem. Just kill that. Golly, I can't stand cats. Anyway, but here's what you find out, though. Those scientists with the rats and the mice that got all the wrong hormones in utero where they give them all this stuff, what they don't tell you is, if you read the reports carefully, if the scientist puts his finger down there in the cage and starts stroking the back, the rat will just raise up its rear end like it wants to be mounted just with somebody's finger stroking on the back. It's instinctual. It's not volitional. And they're not homosexual. They're just animals. And animals do weird things. Some of you growing up on farms, would y'all help me out? You know what I'm saying here? All right. So that's part of the challenge. Well, let's move on. Let's show a couple other things. So there's something, I have to talk to you about something that's going to be bizarre and odd, but I have to talk about it. It's called a disorder of sexual development, and a specific one called a congenital adrenal hyperplasia. There's no ethical way to prove this theory. What they did with the mice and the rats, it's not ethical or legal to do with humans. You would understand that they can't castrate little baby boys in utero. They can't pump kids with the wrong hormone in utero and see what they turn out like 20 years later. That's wrong, it's illegal, and it's unethical. So what we do have are called natural experiments. You guys are aware that sometimes kids are born on rare occasions that have ambiguous genitalia. Is everyone tracking with me? You've heard these stories. Perhaps you've heard the word hermaphrodite. The better word, the more technical phrase, is disorder of sexual development. So that means that these are kids who, because of something which is always clearly diagnosable, by the way, almost always a gene that gets turned around or is missing or something doesn't transfer quite right. So there's several disorders of sexual development. I'm going to talk to you about one. It may be uncomfortable, but it is important to answering the prenatal hormone argument. So please bear with me for a moment. It's called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And here's what happens. Little girls with this disease, because of a genetic anomaly, which is diagnosable clearly, unlike homosexuality, get too much of male testosterone, androgen, in the womb, and when they're born, they have a clitoris that looks like a phallus, okay? It's extra large. I'm not going to go into the consensus that's emerging on how to treat congenital adrenal hyperplasia. But here's what I want you to know. They are girls, and we know they got too much hormones in the womb because of their genitalia. Everybody tracking? You understand? Now the question is, what is their sexual identity when it's older? Because remember, the theory says if you get the wrong hormones in the womb, you're going to be what? You're going to be gay. Got it? That's the prenatal hormone theory. We can't do an experiment that proves such a thing because it would be unethical and wrong and immoral to do it. This is the closest thing to a natural experiment that we might have. Everybody tracking? So what you discover about these girls is this. The large majority of girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia self-identify as heterosexual females when they're older. However, a larger percentage of them than exist in the population. If you're here at lunch, we talked about 2% and lower, depending on how you define homosexuality. I'm going to argue it's really probably closer to 1% when defined by behavior. Actually, people in the population identify as homosexual. Well, a larger percentage than that, a significantly larger percentage by several times, self-identify as homosexual out of these girls that had CAH. But what you find is the vast majority are heterosexual females. So what that tells us is this. It's hard, and by the way, it's hard to disentangle the genetic influence because they have a diagnosable, it can be diagnosed. It's hard to disentangle that from the difficulties they experienced at a very young age of having ambiguous genitalia. Can you imagine the social difficulties that would pose? In fact, there may have been someone here that you were diagnosed with this, and you can give testimony. Yeah, it's challenging because people always ask these questions, and you're like, well, it's just something I was born with, and I'm having to work through it. Doesn't mean these kids are more fallen than the rest of us. It does mean that at an earlier age, they have to deal earlier and more profoundly with the effects of the fall than the rest of us do usually. Does that make sense? But they're not more fallen than us or anything else. It's just a genetic anomaly. But what you find is this. It does not prove that prenatal hormones explain the development of a homosexual identification in most cases. The evidence just isn't strong enough. It shows that there might be, it's plausible there might be some influence at a low level, and I'll talk about that in just a second and explain that. So that's the prenatal hormone theory. Oh, by the way, before I forget, the folks at Heritage Baptist have been very kind. All the PowerPoints I've used are going to be posted on the church website within a couple of days, as well as 4 sets of my class lectures on homosexuality in the Bible, revisionist attempts to say the Bible doesn't say homosexuality is sin, my notes on marriage, and then my notes on the sanctity of life. So those will all be free to you on the church webpage. You can get them in a couple of days. Secondly, do homosexuals have different brain structures than heterosexuals? You probably heard this. I'm a straight guy, but I'm born with a female brain, or I'm a female, and I'm a gay guy, but I'm born with a female brain. That's why I'm gay. Or I'm a gay female, but I have a male brain. That's why I'm gay. This is one of the more common arguments that you hear. So here's the theory stated. Same-sex attraction is caused by men having brain structures more similar to the average woman and women having brain structures more similar to the average man. A lot of research has been done in this area. There's lots of stuff out there. I'm only going to talk about one. It is the one I find referenced most commonly. And if your kids are web savvy, and they are, they're going to be, by the way, here's what you got to realize you're fighting. I'm up here trying to give you some good information. Every one of your teenagers in your home probably has one of these smartphones, and the entire world is 2 clicks away from telling them all sorts of stuff about homosexuality, all sorts of stuff. So if they click it up on their smartphone, brain differences in homosexuals, I think the first thing that's going to come up is a guy named Simon LeVay. He studied a particular part of the hypothalamus called the interstitial nuclei of the anterior hypothalamus. It's just called the INAH. It's 4 cell groups. He is a world-class neuroanatomist. He worked for the prestigious Salk Institute out near San Diego, so he's a real deal researcher. And what he was looking at was a part of the brain that's found here, the INAH. That just gives you an idea of where it's at. I'd like to thank Brother Mortensen for loaning me his laser pointer. So it's right up in there. You're looking at the brain from the side right there. Ladies, here's the part where men think about cars and boats, right up there. That's the, right? Okay. And here's the part where they think about love, right there. Okay, but the cars and boats, anyway. If this is a diagram, if you're looking at it from the front to the back, this would show you an artist's diagram of where these are at, and he's looking at a little cell group right there. But I wanted you to see how very, very discrete this cell group is. When people hear brain structures, you're thinking of some clump of mass that you can see in this sort of thing. Here's a slide from a 2008 study on the same part of the brain. They weren't really looking at homosexuality. To give you an idea of how discrete these areas are, that is the INAH3. You see that little dark cell right there? This is a piece of hypothalamus that's been taken from a cadaver, sliced very thinly, placed on a slide. People donate their bodies to science. This is how science works. They're researching things. The slide then has to be stained so that the cell group can be seen. But do you see how vague it is? And do you see how it's kind of nebulous? You don't quite know where it starts and where it ends. So even secular people admit this is a difficult area of the brain to measure. See what I'm driving at? So this is an actual slide from an actual study on the INAH3. It's and this slide over here, it's barely visible. It's a difficult thing. So here's what you find. He took 41 cadavers of people who came to morgues and donated their bodies to science in the LA area. 19 he identified as homosexual males, 16 as heterosexual males, and 6 as heterosexual women. And what he claimed was the INAH3 cell group, just so you know what I'm talking about, he claimed this little cell group right in here that's barely visible, this dark spot, he claimed that it was twice as large in heterosexual men as it was in heterosexual women. He's claiming there's a difference between the sexes. And then he claimed, there's his big claim, the homosexual men had an INAH3 that was similar in size to the heterosexual women. See what he's claiming? Their INAH3 is the same size as heterosexual women. Therefore, that explains their same-sex attraction. You see what he's driving at? Does everybody understand his claim? So he's claiming because this side of their brain was similar in size to a woman's INAH3, this explains their same-sex attraction. Now, here's the challenge. First of all, LeVay's own data really challenges his claim. I'm about to show you a diagram. It's called a plot diagram. So he's got these people donated their bodies to science. He sliced their brains. He's measuring this INAH3. And then he provided a plot diagram, which we have reproduced for you here, which shows where all these people fell out on the measurement. And LeVay's own data demonstrates the weakness of his claim. I want to show you something. So over here are the females. He's measuring their INAH3. Do you notice this? He's got these 4 females. Their INAH3 is this size. And then notice the homosexual males. You see how they cluster down here? You see that? Everybody seeing that? So he's saying they've got the same size. That's why both of them are attracted to men. Do you understand what he's driving at? Everybody tracking? Okay, now, his own data shows the weakness in his claim. If you look at this plot diagram, here are 3 homosexual males up here who have an INAH3 that's the same size as all these heterosexual males. What that means is that for these men, a particular INAH3 size was not necessary to cause their same-sex attraction. Down here you have 3 heterosexual males who have an INAH3 the same size as most of the homosexual males. What that means is an INAH3 size is not sufficient to cause homosexual attraction. I hope you understand the importance of his own data right there. It's neither a necessary nor sufficient. What that means is I can't look at someone's INAH3 size and predict their sexual orientation. But even more, there's the summary out, and this will be available. People have tried to replicate his data. This has been 25 years, and what I'll go ahead and tell you, it's been 25 years, and no one has clearly replicated his data. And at that point, you have to say, is it ever going to be replicated? The closest it came was a guy named William Bine at a major research center called the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in 2001. He tried to replicate LeVay's data, but here's what he found. He said, well, there's no difference in the number of neurons in this area of the hypothalamus, but they do seem to be packed more tightly in homosexual males. And here's what Bine and his team said. Based on the results of the present study, and they're referring to their attempt to replicate LeVay's work, as well as those of LeVay, sexual orientation cannot be reliably predicted on the basis of INAH3 volume alone. And I can't stress enough, since 1991, there's no clear replication of LeVay's results. Now, the next slide, I got something interesting. Actually, there's 2 differences between male and female brains that are pretty consistent over time. And that is, the first one, men generally have a larger volume of brain. Why? Because God designed men with a slightly larger cranial capacity. Men and women have the exact same intelligence, exact same capacity for intelligence. By the way, Darwin, where are you at, brother? Darwin didn't believe that either in the Descent of Man. He said women were basically dumber. So it's true, he did. I'm not making this up. Read it yourself. As we were challenged at dinner, read a book. So, but seriously, there's no, men and women have same infinite capacity for knowledge, same intelligence, but it's just that because the male cranium capacity is slightly larger, the brain just kind of spreads out a little more. But really the most common difference between male and female brains is this, is that generally men have a higher percentage of white matter and women have a higher percentage of gray matter. But what I would tell you, no one's ever found any differences like that between heterosexuals and homosexuals. They've tried. So it's just not been found. So what can we learn from twin studies? What about twin studies? As you might imagine, this would be fascinating because people, are any of you here an identical twin? Do I have any identical twins in here? Yeah, I hear somebody saying yes. Okay, I see a hand. Yeah, identical twins have been a source of study for science for years. Bless identical twins, really, because everybody wants to poke and prod. Well, how different are you from your sister? How different are you from your brother? What are you like? And they want to know all these things. God bless twins. Well, there's been a lot of research on homosexuality in twins. So the question you might imagine is, if it's genetic, you'd be really interested to know if one identical twin is homosexual, what do you want to know? Is the other one homosexual as well? So what does the data show? I'm about to show you bad data because it still gets reported, and I hear this repeated all the time, and frankly, it's been refuted by secular people, but it still gets repeated. It's really quite maddening. It's this. This guy back in 1991, he claimed that he found in his sample that if you had a homosexual identical twin, 50% of the time in the males, there was the co-twin was a homosexual. That's strong. That's pretty heavy, right? So that would show strong genetic loading for homosexuality. The challenge with this is where he got his sample. Your sample is only as good as the source of the sample. So he got a lot of his sample from gay pride parades by his own admission. And that skewed his sample. And what you found is later on, we now know this data is inaccurate because later on, they got their hands on the entire twin registry of the nation of Australia. Apparently, Australia has a registry of every twin born in Australia. They were able to use this entire sample, and with this much larger and much more representative sample, what you found was that the 1991 data was inaccurate. And with this larger sample, in males, if one identical twin was homosexual, 20% of the time the other one was a homosexual. In females, if one identical twin was homosexual, 24% of the time the other one was homosexual. So there's something going on there because remember, if the Williams Institute is right, and let's say 2% of the people are exclusively gay, if I'm right and it's measured by behavior and it's lower than that, either way, 20% and 24% are much higher than 2%. So there's some variable at work there. We're not clear. Is it social? Is it socialization in these homes? Is it some genetic component? So let me stop right here and let's talk about a genetic component. This can be frightening to Christians. But let me just say, don't be frightened about a genetic component to any number of different temptations. I want to use an example. I live in Kansas City. Besides having a more recent World Series champion than St. Louis, we also have something else, and that is barbecue. And so there's a number of great barbecue joints in Kansas City. One of my favorites is it's called the Gates family. They have a couple of places. I love Gates barbecue. And I actually don't tell Arthur Bryant I like them better than Arthur Bryant. But when I ride by the Gates family barbecue place, I smell it. And let me tell you, I'm like one of Pavlov's dogs. I mean, I start salivating, and suddenly, you know what I want? I want Gates barbecue. I mean, I just want some. Okay. Now, to a certain degree, that's conditioned. But we all know there is a biological genetic component to all that. Why? My body says, that's good, let's get some more, right? And does that mean that gluttony is okay? Well, no. Let me also give you another example. Are you aware that in western Alaska, many of the Inuit villages have chosen to make themselves dry? They realize that in making their villages dry and not having legal alcohol sales, they're going to have to deal with bootlegging. But because of a propensity to alcoholism in that people group, they've made a decision they would rather deal with the battling bootlegging than the widespread alcoholism. There is a genetic variable at work in that people group regarding the degree to which they can process alcohol. Now, does that mean they're born alcoholics? Well, no. But does it mean that within that people group there's a higher propensity of alcoholism? Yes, it does. Is it genetically predetermined? No. Is it genetically affected? Yes. Do you understand the difference? To say genetically predetermined means you have no choice whatsoever. That's never true. To say that there's a genetic component, let me be frank, as long as you and I are living in this thing called a body, there's a genetic component to everything that we do in life. It's just called living in a body and having a body. And someday we're going to get a resurrected and glorified body, and we'll be free from these things. It's living with the effects of the fall. So we as Christians don't deny, contrary to what secular people say, we don't deny a genetic component. Here's what we deny. We deny that you're a genetic automaton. We think you are a whole lot more than a bunch of genes and DNA and chemicals that have learned how to self-reflect. That you have a soul, you're a body-soul unity. They touch at every point. And because you have a soul, you're not like an animal. You're not like those rats in a cage just responding to stimuli. You have a will and you're volitional. And let me tell you, that's a dignifying message. We as Christians have a message of dignity to young people. You're not an animal. You're not just like Lady Gaga, born to any number of doomsday events in your life. No, you can choose volitionally and you can set your life on a dramatic path. Well, let me just say a few things. A Swedish study found very similar results. So this data is robust, looking at the entire twin registry from Sweden. So here's a response. If one identical twin is homosexual, the chances the co-twin will also be homosexual is much higher than in the average population. But the vast majority of co-twins are not homosexual. This higher occurrence demonstrates the plausibility of some genetic factor exhibiting a low level of influence. Actually, this data strongly questions the born this way claim. If homosexuality were completely genetic, there would be 100% correspondence. Do you understand that? There would never be any difference. And there is. There's significant difference. So homosexuality is not a trait or a hair, like your hair or skin color. Is there a gay gene? Has science discovered a gay gene? You guys heard this? The gay gene? So let me talk to you about that. When people, here's the theory stated. People are homosexual because of a gene or genes that cause or causes homosexuality in a manner similar to the way genes code for skin, hair, or eye color. If someone's going to reference this, they're going to refer to a guy named Dean Hamer. Dean Hamer is a world-class researcher. He was the director of gene structure and regulation section at the National Cancer Institute. I'll just give you an aside. He was working at the National Cancer Institute and wound up doing research on genetics and homosexuality. I'm not sure how all that shook out. I'm not sure the politics in that, but just as a taxpayer, I hear National Cancer Institute, you're looking at cancer, right? But then he's publishing stuff on homosexuality. He is a homosexual himself. He's published a film with his partner called Out in Silence about homosexuals in rural communities. But here's what he claimed. He had this big sample and he narrowed it down to 40 gay brothers. They weren't all identical twins, but they're 40 gay brothers. And he claimed that 33 of the 40 pairs of these homosexual brothers had co-inherited genetic information in the X chromosome in a region called XQ28. So that's what you want to hear. If you Google up XQ28 on your smartphone, lots of gay science will pop up. So that's what he claimed. This is 1993. And he did not claim to find a gay gene. He was doing what's called a genetic linkage study. And a genetic linkage study is like this. If I said, how do I get to Bennett Springs from here? You would tell me, turn left out of the parking lot, go down there to the red light, and turn right, correct? And just drive. That's about right. Somebody help me out. That's about right? Okay. So that's what a genetic linkage study does. It says, go here and turn that direction, and you might find something. It's about, and I'm not even sure it's that precise. It may be more like, go out here if you want to get to Springfield, go out here on the interstate and drive 40 miles. It's an imprecise study. It has benefits when you're dealing with hereditary diseases, which can be some of the most nasty. If you have a family with hereditary diseases, you know how painful it can be. These things go quiet for a couple of decades, a couple of generations, and they pop up in another generation. It can be maddening. So genetic linkage studies are helpful with that sort of thing. They're not so helpful with behavioral genetics. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, behavioral genetics is a very fuzzy science. And it has a weak predictive power with all sorts of things, many things which we have much better research on, like alcohol addiction and drug addiction. So when you start talking about something as variable as homosexuality, it's even more precise. But here's what you need to know. XQ28 is not a gene. I've had people refer to it. Well, it's that XQ28 gene. It's not a gene. It is a gene-dense region on the X chromosome that males get from their mothers. And in 1995, he tried to replicate his data. He did another study in 1995, and in 1995, he found a lower statistical significance regarding XQ28. He tried to replicate the data in women. He could find nothing whatsoever in women. Let me go ahead and tell you this right now. All the research on genetics and homosexuality regarding when they're actually trying to find something in the genome, not doing a twin study, but they're looking at the genome, nobody has ever found anything of statistical significance in females, period. Any data they're going to quote you is about males, which is interesting. If the theory is going to be true, why is it only partly true for half the population? You see what I'm driving at? No, but I can't stress that enough. Nobody has found anything for females, period. But he also found that in his 1995 study, Hamer himself found some heterosexual males shared something similar with their homosexual brothers at XQ28. What that means is, we're back to what I said earlier. This is neither necessary nor sufficient to cause homosexuality. You can have it and be homosexual. You can have it and not be homosexual. So even within here's what he said. Here's a quote from his team in 1995. Even within the selected population that was studied, the XQ28 region was neither necessary nor sufficient for homosexual orientation. That's a direct quote from him. To give you an idea, this is a sideways look at the X chromosome. That yellow part down there is the XQ28 gene. And where'd my pointer go? There it is. It's right there. And there are a bunch of genes in there. In fact, I read one point there are 40 different genetic diseases that can be actually traced down to this XQ28 region. It's pretty interesting. So, in 2015, a couple of guys claimed to replicate Bailey. Their names are Sanders and Bailey. Sanders teaches at the University of Chicago. They're looking at a much larger sample. And there was a big hubbub in the media because, Dean Hamer's been vindicated 20-some-odd years later. But when you read the data, it's hard to say that they vindicated Hamer. So they found a couple of areas of interest that some homosexual males were sharing together. They're, again, doing a linkage study. By the way, Hamer does his research in 1993. This is published in 2015. Genetic research has leapfrogged forward in those almost 25 years in between there, 22 years in between. Now, because we finished the Human Genome Project, a much more precise method of tracing genetic diseases has been developed, and now they look at the very base pairs. Remember, genetic leakage study, they're looking at a big region, like the XQ28 region. Now the research is typically done at the base pair level. The computing power is absolutely amazing, the data they process, so they're looking at all the G's and A's and T's and C's lined up down at the base pair level now. It's much more precise. And so a lot of people have asked, why did you use yesterday's method? Why didn't you use today's method? Because we've leapfrogged forward since then. And I don't have a good answer. They said they did the linkage because they just wanted to prove Hamer was right, but we're still not sure what they proved. It's an interesting question. So here's a response and critique. They're using genetic linkage analysis. Using genetic linkage analysis, it points to a region, not to a specific base pairs. That's what Hamer and these guys did in 2015 and 1993. But neither one of them were claiming to have found a specific gene. In both cases, the genetic sequence at XQ28 was different among each of the pairs of the brothers. They didn't share the same G's and A's and T's and C's lined up. It's just a region. What was common was the location. And here's what Sanders and Bailey said. I've got to move forward quickly, so I know I'm moving fast through lots of information. The PowerPoints will be available to you on the church website. But let me stress this again. There are some homosexual people that are convinced that if you and I, as born-again Christians, this is an argument that's repeated frequently, so I'm not making this up. They're convinced that if people like you and I that do not believe that people should participate in same-sex activity, if we could have a prenatal test that would prove someone was going to be homosexual, they're convinced that many of us would abort. Now, I know that's nuts because we're pro-life, but I'm just telling you that's what they claim. So Sanders and Bailey, at the end of their 2015 article, are saying, we know some people are worried that people aren't going to have homosexual kids and they're going to start aborting homosexuals. So in context, that's what they've just said before this next quote. So they're responding to that. And here's what they say. Regarding any scenario that research in this area will result in a prenatal genetic test for homosexuality, the small magnitude of effects suggested herein are inconsistent with the test that those motivated to influence their children's sexual orientation would find useful. They just said there are small magnitude of effects, and basically they're saying you can't predict on what we've just told you. Okay, well then what have you found? At some point we just say, okay, well what is it you're claiming? Again, they admit data on XQ28 is actually just below the threshold for significance. Now, that's fascinating. When they put out their press release, they say, oh, we've duplicated Dean Hamer. But then when you read their peer-reviewed article, they say, well, actually, our data fell just below the threshold for statistical significance. Now, I hate to tell you this, but in science, it's not like hand grenades where close is close enough, right? You have to be precise, and they fell just below the threshold. And in every other study, no one would say, oh, we've replicated it. What everyone else would say, well, we fell below the threshold. Yep. Okay, in 2012, a private company called X23andMe, they're a private company that you can do all sort of business with them about your genetic background. I fear studying the genetic background of my family. Here's what I think I'm going to find out. They're all poor people in Georgia. That's what I know. Right? I already know. But here's what I would say. This company used a huge database. They presented this at American Society of Genetics meeting, of Human Genetics meeting, and using the more modern and precise genome-wide association. What they're looking at is they're down at the very base pairs. You know, down that DNA, you got G's and A's and T's and C's. They're all lined up down through there. They're looking at that level. They had a sample of 23,000. They found nothing that could predict for homosexuality. Now, it's a private company, but it was presented at a professional meeting. I'm just saying, they're the only ones to do a study that big. They found nothing. So no one's discovered a gay gene, some regions of possible interest for some males in particular samples, but no areas of interest ever discovered for females. Does having more older brothers make someone gay? You may have never heard this, but there's a theory out there that says this. Each older brother increases the odds of homosexuality for a male by 33%. It's called the fraternal birth order effect. Claim about 1 out of 7 homosexual men can trace their homosexuality to having an older brother. There's theories for this. They're claiming that the more brothers a woman has, more sons that a woman gives birth to, it affects the antigens in her body, and this affects the hormones that are released to later babies in utero. And so how do you answer this? This is common. It gets repeated a lot. There's problems with the sources of the sample. And if you look at a 2006 study, the entire population of Denmark, they found no substantial birth order effect. I mean, none. And my basic answer to this one is half or more of all homosexual men have zero older brothers. So it's a weak claim, but it gets repeated a lot. You're going to hear about it. So here's a summary. There is no conclusive evidence that homosexuals have a substantially different brain structure than heterosexuals. A survey of modern scientific research demonstrates there are some factors with a low level of influence that correlate with a higher instance of homosexuality among some populations. However, no biological or genetic factors have yet been discovered that cause homosexuality. They're contributing factors, just like it's a contributing factor for all sorts of things. I said at the beginning, correlation doesn't equal causation. Correlation is like this. Okay, so the Royals won the World Series in 2015. We broke even in 2016. So let's say you're doing some research. You said, aha, the Royals won more games in 2015 than won the World Series, and ice cream sales went up in Kansas City. Therefore, as the Royals win more games, more ice cream gets sold. Well, that's possible, but what if you did more research and you discovered there's another variable not at work? This didn't happen, but what if it had been the case that the summer of 2015 was the hottest on record in Kansas City, and so people are buying more ice cream, not because the Royals are winning. Why? Because it's blasted hot. So I'm driving at correlation doesn't equal causation. They're two different things. So what you need to do, and you keep in mind, when these studies are released to the press, invariably they show some low level of correlation between some variable and a higher instance of homosexuality in some groups. But they never show causation. So what happens is when it's released in the peer-reviewed journals, they admit honestly, well, we found a correlation. When it gets repeated in the press always says causation, and they're not the same things. So if I could do one thing for every preacher in the state of Missouri, I would get a stone granite carver to make a big stone block to put in every preacher's office that says correlation doesn't equal causation, because you'll need to tell yourself that for the next 30 years as these studies keep rolling out. So correlation does not equal causation. I have a quote here, and I'm not taking her out of context. I don't believe I'm just quote mining. I think I have her in context. Her name is Linda Diamond. She is a homosexual. She teaches at the University of Utah, teaches psychology there. She's a very engaging person. I tell you, she's just a really a bubbly personality. She's a fantastic speaker. She would disagree with my stance on lots of things. And her argument for homosexuality is really an autonomy-driven argument. And she said this in a lecture at Cornell University in 2013. Here's a direct quote, and I'm telling you, I'm not just quote mining. This is what she said. I feel as a community, the queers have got to stop saying, please help us. We're born this way and we can't change, as an argument for legal standing. I don't think we need that argument, and that argument is going to bite us in the rear end because we know that there's enough data out there and the other side is aware of it as much as we are aware of it. And what she's saying in context is the data doesn't support that claim. Now, she's more intellectually honest. What she actually argues for is, I believe in human autonomy. I don't believe in the Judeo-Christian history, so I just want the right as an autonomous person to do these things. Actually, that's a more honest argument than trying to claim the born this way argument. But you see what she's saying here? This is pretty powerful. Now, I want to say a couple of things about the Scriptures, and I want to be done, and we're going to hear Attorney General Ashcroft. So let me just say a couple of things. I mentioned some of this at lunch. My entire notes on the Bible and homosexuality will be available on the church website. Again, they're lecture notes. They may be boring. They're from an academic. Perhaps they'll help you. You're aware, Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, a very clear denunciation of homosexuality. And I want to point out to you that it's clear. The Bible's not vague, and the Bible's not ambiguous about the issue. Romans 1 is explicitly clear. Romans 1 ties homosexual behavior to idolatry and basically says it is a form of idolatry. But then it goes on and talks about a lot of other sins. It talks about disobedient kids and reviling other people, and it gives a whole litany and a list of really nasty behaviors. And when we read that passage in the middle of the culture wars of the last 40 years, we say, that's right. That's exactly right. God's right. That's what the Bible says. And it's wrong, and people shouldn't do it. And by the way, in verses 24 through 27, Paul repeats a phrase which should cause us to shudder. It is in the active voice, and he says 3 times, and God handed them over, and God handed them over, and God handed them over 3 times. I mean, it is almost frightening. So there's this degree to which God hands people over. Now, all of us are wrestling with sin in this life. Have you ever met some of these Christians that tell you, well, I'm to the point I don't struggle with sin anymore? You ever met those folks? Most annoying people you've ever met in your life, right? You're like, well, yeah, I can actually list 2 or 3 for you, brother. Let me go ahead and help you out right now. But so we're all fighting sin. And I want us to see ourselves and homosexuals in the same light. We're all sinners. That's what and we're not here to preach homophobia. I don't want someone to go out and beat up a homosexual. That's not, this horrid man who went into a bar in Orlando. It's horrid. No, that's not who we are. That's not what we want. We want them to repent and to believe. But we have to understand, if the gospel's true, we're all fighting sin. All of us are. And so to that degree, we're not different from them. We're not any different at all. We're all in the same boat. We're sinners fighting sin. But I want to tell you, Paul sets you up for something. You do know that the chapter and verse divisions came later in the Bible, right? And so Paul didn't write the chapters. They were added very helpfully about 1,000 years later so we can navigate our way through the Scripture, and I'm happy for them. But because of that, sometimes we miss something. Paul is setting us up in Romans 1. So I'm going to ask you something. Do you agree with what Paul says in Romans 1? You agree with it? When he says homosexuality is a sin, you agree with that? Well, guess what? He's setting you and I up. Because look what he says in chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore, any one of you who judges is without excuse. For when you judge another, you condemn yourself, since you who judge do the same things. You know what he's saying? Heterosexual sin, homosexual sin, it's sin. And listen, for you and I, you know what we need to keep in mind? If you and I are going to say that's sin, we better remember that according to the Apostle Paul, we're saying we're sinners. We're condemning ourselves. And that's why the book of Romans is all about grace. We are saved by grace. Where sin did abound, grace abounded all the more. I close with a story that is very difficult for me to tell, and it is painful. but I feel compelled to share it. And it's a true story, and it really happened. I was a pastor in North Carolina for 8 years, Turner Memorial Baptist Church. We don't know if Mr. Turner was saved, but they named the church after him. You know, only Baptists would do that. But anyway, Turner Memorial Baptist Church. And we lived in a Baptist parsonage for 7 of those years. My wife is now post-tribulation on her eschatology. She lived in a Baptist parsonage for 7 years. I'm telling you what, it's, man. You know, I'd go wherever the Lord tells me to go, but, I mean, he's going to have to call me collect before I live in another parsonage, just to be honest. But that was an experience. But we're living in the parsonage, and so the roof leaked, and I had 2 neighbors next door, Daniel and Dennis, and they were gay men. I'm going to tell you something. I want you to listen to what I'm about to tell you. They were very good neighbors, and I liked them, and they liked me, and they liked my wife. They were good neighbors. Same-sex marriage was not legal at that time in North Carolina or anywhere. They had an affirming ceremony at a very liberal church there in the Raleigh area. So Daniel and Dennis, they were everything that the pro-homosexual crowd says. They're committed, devoted, monogamous, loving relationship, right? And I witnessed to them about Christ. I remember that Dennis's father had died, and we were standing in the driveway, and I went through the whole evangelism explosion outline with him and shared Christ with him. And, you know, he didn't get saved. And Daniel was younger. He's probably about 10 years younger than Dennis. One day, the roof was leaking on the parsonage, and I couldn't get the property committee to get it fixed. My gay neighbor was on the roof helping me fix the roof on the parsonage. Right-wing Southern Baptist preacher and his homosexual neighbor on the roof trying to fix a leak on the parsonage. They were good neighbors. And they moved away. I remember the last time I saw him was Miss Josephine Carroll's funeral. And about a year after that funeral, I ran into Wendy Reekvelt, one of my church members. She and her husband worked in law enforcement. She said, "Pastor, did you hear about Daniel?" I said, "No, what about Daniel?" That was Dennis's partner. I said, "Daniel died." It would be inappropriate in a public gathering to describe Daniel's death scene to you. Dennis claims he didn't know Daniel was into these things, but Daniel died attempting sadomasochistic acts, which are common in the homosexual community. And his death scene was horrid. I want you to listen to me. I don't fear homosexuals. I fear for anybody that tries to do what God says don't do. And it's not because that's not hate, that's not anger, and that's not fear. That's love, and that's compassion. And I want us to have compassion and patience, and it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of mercy. But I pray that God would use us. Let's pray, could we? Father, thank you for the good news about Jesus. Father, help us, Lord, to be compassionate to people with whom we disagree. And though they may be ugly to us, help us respond in kindness. Help us to love our enemies, dear God. Help us not to hate. Help us to forgive. And Father, I pray that they be drawn to Christ. And I pray that they be saved. And I pray that Jesus would give them the strength to overcome temptation just as he gives us the strength to overcome temptation. God, we pray it would be so. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you.